Welcome to the second video in the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre and Australian Data Science Education Institute's workshop on making STEM real. In this video, we're going to talk about analysing your data. The first step in analysing your data is much simpler than people think, and it's really fundamental. You can start with really simple techniques in a spreadsheet to get some understanding of what your data set is doing. For example, you can start with sorting your data set, figure out what the largest and smallest values are, filtering it to look for particular values that are over a particular threshold or that meet some other characteristic. And it's amazing what information you can get simply by calculating the average. One of the very important things to do with a data set is to graph it, because that gives you a much better understanding than just looking at the numbers. But it's also important to look at what questions a data set can answer. And the crucial first step in that is that data can answer quantitative but not qualitative questions. So data can answer how many, what size, how big, how bright, but it can't answer things like what is the best, what is the nicest, things like that. So when I first did the election data set with my year 10s, we looked at the Senate votes for the federal election for Victoria, so every vote, which was over 3 million lines of CSV file. And when I asked the kids, what questions can this data set answer, the first thing they said was, it can tell you who's the best party. Now, I wish it could. But the data actually shows who got the most votes. And best is an entirely subjective and really ill-defined characteristic. Is the party that got the most votes the best party? Well, not according to anybody who voted for a different party. So you can see qualitative is tricky, but quantitative is really straightforward. Okay, so when you start with a data set, you want to analyze it, you want to visualize it, which is communicating the answer to your question. But when you visualize, it's really important to remember to make your visualization accurate so that the values properly represent the values that you found in your analysis. It should be valid, meaning it shows what you think it shows or what the reader thinks it shows. And the key part, and this is somewhere that most spreadsheet packages fall down, and indeed most programming packages, and this is why I often recommend that people do their visualizations by hand, the key part is it should be compelling. Graphs are not very interesting in themselves. They're not very persuasive. So if you can use some kind of drawing technique to make them more compelling and more interesting, then that's really effective. The last step, which is often something professional data scientists miss, is they need to be readable, which means you need to have your axes properly labeled and you need to have the values on your axes clearly readable and in a sufficiently large font and not too many of them clustered together. You need to have not too much information on the graph. You need to make the information that you want to convey on the graph really well highlighted and very easy to pick out. And it also means ideally you need all of the points on the graph to be labeled so that you can figure out exactly what each column in your column graph or point on your line graph or wedge in your pie chart, what that value actually represents, rather than just trying to read it off a graph which often doesn't have grid lines or other ways of getting the value accurately. One thing that is often also missed in traditional data science is the idea that you need to understand the domain in order to properly analyze the data. There's an ethos, particularly in the way we teach maths, that you can do the same techniques on any kind of data set and you get meaningful results. So we teach that, for example, continuous data uses a line graph and discrete data uses a column chart, and that's all we need to know about graphing. But actually sometimes discrete data needs to use a line graph, and sometimes continuous data is actually sensibly represented in a column chart. It depends what you're trying to present and what you're trying to show. Visualization is a form of communication first and foremost, and if you don't understand your domain and don't really understand the data, then you can't communicate it effectively. It also sometimes changes the way you actually analyze the data and what it means. For example, whether you throw away outliers, you need to know what the outliers represent and whether they're realistic. So some of the key questions that you ask with the data the first time you look at it are things like, how was the data collected? Because sometimes there are problems with the way the data was collected. There might be, if it's survey data, there might be people who weren't surveyed, who weren't available that day, or who weren't in that representative or so-called representative sample. What does each field mean? What does it represent? What actually does this data show? And how are the fields related? So it's understanding that real-world implication of how the data interacts and what it means, what each category means, and what the implications of changes are in each field. And the last one is really important. Why does this data matter? Why should I care? It's also incredibly important to be skeptical about your data and to be effectively skeptical, rationally skeptical. So you need to look at what the weaknesses are in the data set, because there are always weaknesses. No data set is perfect. There are weaknesses in, for example, the way it was collected. Again, as we said before, you might have missed some people in your survey, or you might have not collected overnight, or you might have, there's all kinds of ways in which data can be flawed. And since no data set is perfect, you need to figure out what those ways are before you analyze it and before you make assumptions about the validity of your results. You also need to look at the values recorded versus the values you actually wanted. And this is something we call proxy data, and it's often a big problem. So we assume that the data we have is actually a valid representation of the question that we're studying, but often it's only the closest data we could get. The classic example of that is exam results. What we like to think is that exam results measure learning and that they're an accurate and valid measure of a student's learning. But actually, exam results can have a whole host of other impacts. How the student was feeling on the day, what the conditions were when they took the test. Was there a lot of noise outside? Were they feeling unwell? And also it depends how well the exam was written. I've written some shocking exam questions that really don't test what I thought they tested. So the idea that the exam result reflects the student learning is, we hope it's close, but it's not actually the same thing. We're not measuring student learning. We're measuring student performance on an exam, on a particular exam, on a particular day, under particular conditions. It's not necessarily the same thing, and it's important to remember that. So that's often the case with a data set, that you have the data you could easily collect rather than the data set that you want. Another great example of that is a project I worked on with Pawsey and the West Australian Marine Science Institute, where they had whale observation data. So they'd counted the whales passing in the water off the West Australian coast. And what they could see was the whales who breached. So what they were actually counting was breaches, not whales. So the same whale may have breached twice, or even more, or some whales might not breach at all. What they want is how many whales are in that water. What they've got is how many breaches did we see, not even how many whales did we see breach. So it's not the same value. It's a proxy for it. Hopefully it's close enough, but it's not the same thing. Okay. So we also need to think about the accuracy and the validity of the data. Now, accuracy is simply, will we measure it? If we measure it twice, will we get the same value? Is this a good measure of the value? The second is validity. So are we measuring what we think we're measuring? And if you come back to that idea of proxy data, when we measure learning, how valid is an exam? Does it actually measure learning accurately, or does it only cover a section of the course? Are the questions misleading? All that kind of stuff. And also, sometimes the way the data is stored can be an issue. So sometimes there simply isn't enough room to store all of the data. That's certainly the case with the square kilometre array, which is being built in Western Australia. That produces way too much data to even store, so they have to process it and then store it, which could be a problem if there's a flaw in the processing. Sometimes stored data gets corrupted for some reason, a bit of it gets written over, or a bit of it gets changed for some reason. There's all kinds of potential issues there. Sometimes it's just difficult to find the data you want in a data storage. So there's a whole lot of potential problems with the data. And you need to make sure you consider those before you start to analyze it. All right, once we get to the actual analysis, we're looking really at, there's a whole lot we can do with just basic spreadsheet work. Okay, so one of the examples that I want to look at to show the power of simple spreadsheet techniques is the small scale solar installation data set, which is for the whole of Australia, and it shows solar installations from 2001, with the more recent ones from January 2020 broken down by month. But it shows the installations by postcode. So the first thing you want to think about when you look at this data set is, what do all of the columns mean? And you can see the first column is postcode. That's pretty straightforward. The second column is previous years. So the aggregate of 2001 to 2019, and that's number of installations. Installations quantity is number of installations. Whereas the third column, column C, is rated output, meaning it's the total solar energy that we can generate using all of those panels. So the first thing I want to do is I want to see which postcodes are best for solar. What are the top 20 postcodes, say, in Australia? So I'll just move my window down so that you can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to highlight the entire data set by clicking in the corner here. This is in Google Sheets, but the same techniques will work with minor variations in Excel and numbers or whatever spreadsheet you use. Okay, so we're going to go to Data, Sort Range. It has a header row, and we want the third column, which is the rated capacities, the total generation. A to Z will give us smallest to largest, so we want to go Z to A because we want to see the top 20, the top postcodes for solar generation. All right. Now, you can see that of the top, we can only see the top 14 in this window, but you can see that most of them are either starting with a 4 or starting with a 6, and there's a couple starting with a 3. Now that was really interesting to me when I first looked at this data set, because 4 and 6 are WA and Queensland, or the other way around, I think. And 3 is Victoria. So I did not expect that WA and Queensland would be the best for solar, and I got really excited and I started to write it up. And then because I can program in Python, I wrote a little script to separate it out by state and figure out the average solar installations by postcode for each state. And what I found was that WA and Queensland were the worst for solar. In fact, they were nowhere near the best, and it just so happens that the top postcodes are in WA and Queensland because there were a bunch of new developments there, and new developments have to meet the government sustainability standards to get a 5-star rating, and so they all had solar. So that was a really good lesson for me in the first assumptions about a data set being wrong. But what was really interesting was I then looked up this data set because it had just been released with a bit of media fanfare, and I looked up how it had been reported, and without exception every news article that reported this data set said WA and Queensland are the best for solar. So, you know, it's a rookie mistake, but everyone's making rookie mistakes, which is one of the reasons we need to teach data science. Okay, the other thing to know about this data set is that, like all data sets, it's proxy data. What we actually want to know is how many solar panels are there out there that are currently generating electricity. What this data set tells us is how many solar panels were installed. So it doesn't tell us about solar panels that were that have stopped working or that are broken. It doesn't tell us where some of those installations may have replaced older installations. Doesn't tell us how many solar panels are currently generating. It tells us how many solar panels are installed. which is an approximation, probably a fairly good one, but it's proxy data. It's not actually the data we want, it's the data we have. Okay, now to go back to the slides for a minute. So summary statistics are really important and can be really powerful. And by that I mean simple things like calculating average or the mean. The median is sometimes very different to the mean, and that's a whole other video, and the standard deviation. But I recommend that you go and look at Anscombe's quartet, because summary statistics do have their weaknesses, and you can have wildly different data sets that have very similar mean and standard deviation. If we go and look at this Wikipedia page right now, you can see here 4 different data sets which all have almost identical summary statistics, but they have wildly different distributions. This one is skewed by an outlier. This one is a whole bunch of points on the same pretty much x coordinate, but very different on the y. This one's a big curve. This one's pretty scattered. So they all have the same summary statistics, but they're wildly different data sets. And that's very important to remember if you're relying on summary statistics for your analysis. Okay, so that really confirms the key point, which is that we need to double check and test everything. And we need to ensure that the kids double check and test everything. When they think they've found a result, they need to prove it. They need to figure out, more importantly, they need to try to disprove it. So they need to figure out all of the ways in which it could be misleading or just plain wrong and test the heck out of it. We can also use graphs for understanding a data set, and they're a really important way of getting an overview of the data. And now using graphs for understanding is very different to using graphs for communicating. So graphing for understanding is where you're looking for trends and patterns. You're not so worried about making sure that your axes are labeled and making sure that it's the right graph type and that kind of thing. You're just trying to figure out what's going on with the data. And sometimes you want to cycle through all of the graphs available in your spreadsheet package to see what insights you can get into your data. They're great for finding trends, for identifying anomalies, which is your outliers, and for showing key features like where the data changes and under what conditions. And choosing the right graph type is a matter of exploration sometimes. It's not as simple as the maths curriculum would tell you, would have you think, which is, line graph for continuous data and a bar chart for discrete. It's much more complicated than that. Okay, so that's enough for our data analysis video. We're going to move on now. The third video in this series is going to be the fundamentals of visualization. Stay tuned and catch you next time.